The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to conduct a lecture concerning educational psychology. Now, in this specific presentation, you are to expect some of the following topics. So, for example, expect to hear about aspects of what are the methods of learning and why is it that we utilize educational psychology, the history of educational psychology, and also you are going to learn about aspects of what assessments do we use in order to address for intelligence? And therefore, we're going to learn a little bit about what intelligence is and different schools of thought of when we are addressing intelligence. So let's get started. So one of the first things that we would like to do today is explain where educational psychology came from. So we revert to your presentation. Notice that one of the aspects that we need to do is define the term educational psychology. What is the intent of educational psychology? Notice that in this specific regard, remember that psychology is interested in studying human behavior. I should say, particularly geared towards the prediction of human behavior. So wherever there is behavior, there's going to be psychology. And in education, of course, that's one of the places where we would find behavior. Notice that in regards to educational psychology, what we are interested in is basically how is it that humans learn and retain knowledge? What is the aspects that are involved in our retention of knowledge, particularly focused in educational settings. So what are some of the topics that you may find? Well, the first one of the aspects that we can look into is notice how individuals provide instructions, for example, teaching methods, and also how is it that we measure instruction, right? So for example, the aspects of testing methods, how is it that we measure in regards to knowledge of our students? Another topic that educational psychology may be interested in, both in practice and research, is that of classroom environment. Notice that individuals can be impacted by their surroundings, and a classroom is not an exception. Therefore, an educational psychologist will be interested in knowing what aspects of our environment can contribute to the knowledge and acquisition of learning. Another significant aspect that I would like to mention is that of the factors, the variables that are involved in an educational setting. So it's not just simply learning. An educational psychologist or persons that work within this field, I should say, are also focused on the social manners, on the behavioral manners, and perhaps behavioral problems that could be limiting and could actually be impacting learning and impacting that learning process. Now, there are certain practitioners that are geared towards this specific practice, and that is of an educational psychologist. Notice that contrary to other forms of psychologists, notice that an individual who works in this field is particularly geared towards learning outcomes. So the individual is trying to measure and ascertain whether an individual is meeting and has defined and then meeting learning outcomes. Also distinguishing if an individual has certain attributes that could assist them in regards to being a better student. Notice that another concern is that an individual who works as an educational psychologist, remember that they are actually interested not just in the student, but also how is instruction provided. So an educational psychologist would be immensely interested in factors, for example, of how is it that a teacher, an instructor, a professor, or a lecturer is providing instruction to his or her students. Now, something that you need to remember is that generally, in order to work in educational psychology, individuals are required to have a graduate degree. So it would be in the form of a master's level or a doctoral level, particularly that geared towards a Ph.D. So generally, this is an expectation that you can have with the educational requirements of an educational psychologist. Now, in looking at the specific history, I will give you the opportunity to look at this slide, but there are some persons that I would like to discuss a little bit more in detail. For example, one of the things that we would like to look into is that of scientific publications. So notice that without research, we wouldn't have practice, and therefore the publication of scientific research is immensely important in order for practitioners to do what they do, whether it be in the educational field, in the clinical field, and other areas. Notice that one of the persons that I would like to mention is that of G. Staley Hall. And what is the importance of this individual? Well, this individual was the individual who focused in the foundation of a psychology journal, but specifically geared towards matters of education. Notice that some other aspects that we would like to mention is that of Thorndike in 1906. In regards to the specific contribution that we expected was that this individual was the first person to publish a book in regards to educational psychology. We do have specific divisions that are geared towards individuals in regards to the psychological practice within education and within the American Psychological Association. Notice that we have Division 15 in order to satisfy that need of educational psychology and the professional practice here in the United States. Now, in this specific regard, I will give you a moment to look at this slide, but I do want to focus on one individual, and that is of Benjamin Bloom. Notice that one of the particular contributions of this gentleman was the taxonomy of goals of educational objectives. And why is this important? Well, notice that one of the aspects that he would cover was how is it that we can analyze, synthesize, and evaluate aspects of learning. So this is one of the individuals that I did actually want to bring up to your attention, particularly those who are taking my lecture. But I do want you to go ahead and take your time and review the rest of the individuals who in fact contribute with aspects of educational psychology. Now, as I mentioned earlier, remember that without research, we wouldn't have practice. So because of that reason, we do need research individuals, persons whose sole focus and part of their focus could be that geared in regards to practice. So what are some of the areas that we might be interested in when conducting research in the aspects of educational psychology? Notice that one of the features that I would like to look into as a researcher, and for those of you who are watching at your own accord at home, notice that one of the topics that an educational psychologist and or researcher would be interested in when it comes to research areas in education, notice that one of the aspects would be approaches to learning. What are some of the features and characteristic? What exactly do we actually do in order to learn? Notice that another aspect that is significant and important in regards to education is that of myth, because unfortunately, many individuals believe they have an understanding of what the aspect of learning styles is when it comes to specific individuals. But notice that because of popular media and pseudoscience or perhaps misinformation, individuals may not necessarily know what an appropriate learning style is. So therefore, the research and the scientific method, as I mentioned earlier, not only is the focus of educational psychology within the students, but educational psychology does cross that limit within the student, and we're also interested in the approach of the teachers. So notice that we're also interested in what is it that an effective teacher will need in order to impart good knowledge as to for their students, I should say, to be able to learn. Notice that we can also be a little more specific when it comes to the type of knowledge that individuals can provide when it comes to research. So we're also interested in how is it that individuals can learn, what types of teaching styles, what types of teaching procedures can we have when it comes to teaching specifically reading and writing. And the last thing that I would like to talk about is what are the aspects of language? What are the aspects of language, for example, just the phonics or the whole language as it comes to education? When it comes to the aspects of educational psychology, notice that some individuals may pursue a doctoral degree. Notice in this specific case, I should say, individuals may be geared towards applied experimental psychology. What do I mean by applied experimental psychology? Research that is intended to be applied to the field, where I like to call rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands in the mix when it comes to practice. So the research is not merely for research or psychology as a field, but that type of research is interested in that specific application towards real life problems. So an individual who holds said doctorate, perhaps their main focus is part of my research is going to be for the purpose of applying solutions and finding and applying solutions for real life problems. So for instance, issues with individuals who are trying to learn. Notice that part of the practice that is generally required for a doctorate is that of an internship. Notice that an internship means that the person will actually get to practice. They actually get to practice what they are learning, what they have learned within their doctorate. And in this specific case, what we're trying to do is this individual will practice in regards to tests and measurements. So for instance, this individual may work in a place where they provide educational testing services. So notice that an individual may be geared towards focusing simply on the test and measurement, right, of a person. So perhaps the vast majority of their internship will be guided and would be geared towards the test and assessment of the research participants that could be part of their internship. Notice that when we're thinking of a doctorate in applied psychology, some of the interests that the person may have could include, for instance, teaching methods, also instructional processes, and lastly, learning outcomes. You heard me say about a researcher who is interested in assessments and measurements, but we also have an individual who does this outside of the research perspective, and that is of a psychometrist. A psychometrist is basically an individual who has the ability of doing two things. The first thing that I like to mention is that they're basically a hybrid. They are a hybrid between that applied experimental research focus, but they're also interested in services. Therefore, they can see clients. They will see clients, sometimes referred in certain settings as patients. And in regards to their clients, more specifically, what we are referring to is they will have students in which they would provide assessments. Now, let me remind you that at a master's level, generally, the individual will be able to administer said test, may be able to write a report of the findings. However, it would take a doctor in psychology to be able to provide said interpretation of the report. Notice that some of the things that we will look into, for example, would be the administration of the WISC or the WAIS. And what is the WISC? Well, the WISC and the WAIS we're actually going to cover a little bit more in detail later on, but the WISC is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. We also have the adult version of that scale, and that is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Survey. Now, I did want to show you guys an example of the WAIS. This is one of the previous editions. This is an older edition of the WAIS, but in regards to the specific instrument, notice that this would be the manual that we will use for scoring, and also the administration of said instrument. I've had the opportunity to administer the WAIS previously in other settings, not necessarily in the educational setting, but I've had the real opportunity to be able to conduct and administer the WAIS, and also to be able to write the reports and under supervision do the interpretation of said assessment. So notice that a person who focuses as a psychometrist will have the opportunity of conducting said administration along with other instruments that are available to us. Now, it would be somewhat difficult to attempt to study the field of educational psychology without aspects of intelligence. So let's take a look at the definitions of intelligence and what does that look like, perhaps in a general setting and also in the setting of educational psychology. So let's get started. To take this opportunity to be able to define the term intelligence. Now, immensely simply put, intelligence is the ability of having knowledge. It's also the ability of being able to efficiently use said knowledge and the amount of knowledge to reason, to conduct reasoning about our world. Notice that something immensely interesting about intelligence is that it allows us to use reasoning, right? It allows us to use reasoning in order to adapt to our surroundings. So if we're not able to adapt to our surroundings, we can start imparting knowledge, and therefore with that knowledge, increase the capability of reasoning. So that is now one of the earlier aspects that we have in regards to intelligence testing comes of that from Binet. Now, Binet was the individual who is generally credited as having developed the first modern form of intelligence testing. At the time he was recruited, this was conducted in France. He was recruited by the French government to be able to identify children who needed help. Basically, what the French government sought to do was to be able to accurately assess children who might have had learning disabilities, which before we used to refer as mental retardation, but I do need to remind you that that term is dated. It could be considered as a term of insult, and therefore it is a term that we do not utilize in the field. So it is actually referred as learning disability. So I did want to include that little caveat in our presentation. Notice that Binet was tasked with the challenge of creating an assessment through which we could identify individuals who needed extra help because they had learning disabilities. So he was tasked in doing so, and therefore created one of the more modern and perhaps the first modern aspect of being able to conduct intelligence assessment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this particular aspect and this particular testing was developed in France. However, we had the ability later on to translate and adapt said assessments to individuals who spoke English. And this is generally credited to Terman. Notice that this individual did conduct that particular translation and adaptation. And generally, currently, we refer to this assessment as the Stanford Binet assessment. Notice that now we have conducted and created at this time a verbal test for an intelligence quotient. Notice that not only that, but we also had the ability to move from children. We also started to measure adult intelligence. Now, I've seen the term IQ, and so have you, when it comes to intelligence. But is it purely intelligence? Well, whenever you see the term IQ, I want you to remember that it involves two different types of age. The first age that is involved in an IQ is that of your chronological age. Notice that chronological age is simply that based on your birthday, the day that you were born, and your current age right now. Now, the other aspect that is involved in an IQ is that of your mental age. This is generally what we refer to as the level of intelligence, or where a person's capabilities are at the time of their assessment. So when we are thinking about IQ, I should say, is not simply that individual measurement, but rather two separate types of age. So I do want you to remember that. Now, another significant contribution when it comes to intelligence assessment falls that in the realm of war efforts. Notice that at the time, we were trying to recruit many individuals, particularly in the setting of the world wars. So we needed to have a valid and reliable measure, I should say. Wanted to have a valid and reliable measure in order to be able to recruit individuals to support the war effort at the time. And because of that, Yerkes and Bingham were tasked with the challenge of creating an assessment that would be able to assess for potential recruits. Notice that their main goal was to address and create a measurement of IQ, but particularly geared towards a group setting. Notice that they were able to develop the Army Alpha and the Army Beta test. In this specific regard, they were tasked to measure and do group assessments. So therefore, they are a little bit easier to administer because it doesn't require that it is one examiner with one examinee, rather that it could be just one examiner and a wide variety of individuals that are going to be assessed at the same time. So it did cut down, I should say, the amount of time that it would require to administer said test. And as I mentioned, we had two aspects. We had the alpha, which was the traditional test that they created, but they also created the beta version. And the beta version was particularly geared for individuals that did not necessarily speak English, or they were not fluent in English. And therefore, it was an intelligence assessment that was for non-English speaking participants. And here is an illustration of said assessment at the time. Notice that here, towards the right of your screen, we have a specific illustration of a sample of what the assessment would look like. Notice that one of the things that they were able to determine was that many of the individuals had the mental age of an individual of 13 years old, the mental age of an individual of 13 years old. The problem with this specific assessment was that this is an erroneous conclusion. Why is that? Well, if you recall earlier, we talked about how the environment can play a role in how we learn, but it can also have an impact. So your environment can have an impact on how you're being tested, on how you're being assessed. So because of that, if you are administered a test under stressful situation, notice that now this test is going to be biased. Notice that because of this assessment, of this conclusion, notice that later the creator had to retract the specific conclusion. Now, in keeping with the topic of bias, remember that part of your approach as a future scientist, as a future researcher or psychologist and or practitioner, notice that part of your responsibilities is to reduce the impact of bias or reduce bias altogether. And why is that? Well, because as we noted earlier, there could be some limitations with interpretation and conclusions of assessments. And we also have another example of how is it that bias can be and lead to faulty conclusions. Notice that in this specific regard, we are going to talk about Goddard. And what happened was that this individual did translate Binet's test into languages of the immigrants to the US in 1910. Notice that this translation could have been biased. And why is that? Because when the individual translated the actual test, remember that translations, for instance, there are individuals who are not particularly knowledgeable about a certain dialect. So for example, some individuals may not be accustomed to some of the slang that we may utilize here, and also some of the slang and cultural differences that could be in. Notice that in regards to the slang that we may have, notice that because of language differences, some individuals may not be able to understand an assessment, which is exactly what occurred in this particular aspect. Notice that because of the limitations that we had in translation, we erroneously labeled individuals who were immigrants as feeble-minded. Notice that this is an erroneous conclusion because the individual is not necessarily a person who may have a learning disability. It's simply a person who cannot understand what they are being asked. Because of that, Goddard was actually faced with the possibility that his research was not correct, and therefore he retracted his conclusions. I like to think about, for example, I speak English as my first language. So if I had to take an assessment, say, for example, in Chinese, which is a language that I'm absolutely not familiar with, is it really that I'm going to be considered and I'm actually feeble-minded? Should I take an intelligence assessment in Chinese, or is it that I am unable to understand the questions that I am being asked? So because of that concern, he actually had to retract his conclusions. Keeping with the example of the Wesler, notice that in keeping with our history, notice that Wesler then developed the modern set for intelligence testing. Notice that one of the efforts that he tried to do was to normalize IQ based on age group. Before that, we weren't necessarily too prone to understand The differences in IQ measurements were highly dependent upon which age group are you being compared to. So for instance, if I were to provide a calculus assessment to a group of college students, it's a fair assessment. It could be a fair assessment in regards to their knowledge of mathematics, but it wouldn't be a fair assessment of the knowledge of mathematics of a 5-year-old. So if I gave a calculus assessment to a 5-year-old, notice that the chances of this 5-year-old being compared to a group of his peers would be unfair. Therefore, what Wechsler did was that he started noticing that IQ can be grouped and separated based on different age groups. Now, when we are looking at the Wechsler, notice that, as I noted, Wechsler did develop the first set of modern IQ tests. Notice that one of the significant factors that he contributed under was that he included aspects of subscales, particularly those geared towards verbal and performance. Notice that he included aspects of vocabulary. So notice the aspects of language, and he also included block design. So here is a very small example of the block design. And as I mentioned earlier, I have administered this specific assessment. So what you would do, we actually have the blocks, right? We have blocks, and we will present the individual with a pattern. So we would present them with an image, and the individual has to recreate the image with the blocks provided. So it's an aspect in which an individual can produce a specific image, and they have a certain amount of time. We do measure how long it takes for the person to complete the design. And of course, the more progression we have, the more complex the design is going to be. Notice that something interesting about the Wechsler is that it averages at 100. So the IQ score, I should say, it's average at 100. Again, the Wechsler is also interested in age scales. Now, currently, the WAIS, which is the adult version, and is different from the one that I showed you earlier, because the one that I showed you earlier is a little older, but for illustration purposes, I did want to bring that up here for the lecture. And notice that currently we are in the 5th version of the WAIS. And remember that the WAIS is for adults and the WISC is for children. Now, when we are thinking of the distribution, notice that something that we need to mention is a normal distribution. What you are seeing here, for those of you who may not be familiar, this is what we call a bell of normal distribution. What is a bell of normal distribution? It's basically an illustration of what the expectation of the average is. So notice that it is in a bell shape, and what we expect is that the vast majority of individuals are going to fall within the center of that shape of that bell. But notice the further away that we move from the center, the less people are going to be in the average, right? The less people are going to be closer to that middle section. Notice that we can see the average right here. Notice that it is the highest peak. Therefore, the vast majority of individuals are going to be included in the center, right? The vast majority. So notice that the further away we move from the center, the smaller the sections get. So notice how big the blue sample is, because about 68% of persons are going to fall somewhere within the center, within the average IQ, which again is 100. But as we start moving towards the left, we start moving towards the negative. So notice that from 100, the further along we move to the left, notice that now we're starting to have less scores, right? Less number. Notice that past 2 standard deviations. So what do I mean by that? So this is the average of 100 and one block or one section, if you will, that will be 1 standard deviation, and that will be an IQ of 85. But then if I move a second time, 2 standard deviations here, notice that now we have an IQ of 70, which in this case, now the person can be considered as borderline intellectually disabled. Again, the term is not mental retardation. We use aspects of learning disabilities at this time. Of course, these terms do change as time progresses. So some individuals, hopefully by the time you see this video, the term is still intellectually disabled. But again, as of the time being, it is considered a learning disability and not mental retardation. Notice that once we start moving to standard deviations from this mean, this average score, notice that now we can start considering, okay, this person is perhaps suffering from a learning disability. As we keep moving forward, notice that if we move yet again another third standard deviation, notice that now the IQ is much less. And as we keep moving towards the negative side of things, towards the left, notice that here we only had about 13% of the population, 2 standard deviations, we have 2%, and so on and so forth until we basically hit close to that 100%. Notice that then severely intellectually disabled persons will make up a smaller group of individuals. Now, we can also understand the distribution of IQ. Notice that we can also do it towards the positive side, meaning that we are adding a score. Again, remember that the average person is going to fall anywhere between 85 and 115 points when it comes to their IQ. So notice that in this specific regard, we will have the average of 100. Notice that once we move past 1 standard deviation, anywhere between 115 and 30, notice that this individual may be considered to have a superior IQ after we move 2 standard deviations. So now we're moving towards 130. Notice that this individual could be considered to be in the very superior range. And once we move 3 standard deviations, notice that an IQ of 145 and greater, this person could be considered as gifted. Now, we do have aspects of testing, as I was mentioning earlier. Notice that the characteristics of test, we need to remind you that tests tend to be systematic, or we have to have a goal to develop systematic tests. We also have to have the goal of having an objective test, meaning that the test will remain the same irrespective of interpretation. The interpretation and the options to answer the items presented are always going to remain the same, and they are not ambiguous. They're not open for interpretation. And also notice that here we are presented with the term standardized. And when we are talking about standardization, what we are referring to is that it is actually reflected, right, to a specific environment, and that those scores allowed for the calculation. If we move to our previous slide, that allow us for the calculation of a norm. So notice that again, this is a bill of normal distribution, and that the scores allow us for this type of measurement. Notice that we are also required to have psychometric characteristics of validity and reliability. What is validity? Validity, very simply put, is my instrument measuring what it is intended to measure? So for example, if I am conducting a measurement of temperature, that I would develop an instrument that is intended to measure temperatures, for example, a thermometer. Notice that when we're thinking about reliability, we are thinking about something, a measurement that remains constant, that remains the same over time. So for example, if I grab a ruler, right? A ruler is a valid measure for inches, right? Or for feet. So notice that validity means it is measuring what is intended to measure. But is it reliable? So reliable is that I'm always going to get the same measurement every time. So if I grab a ruler and I set it on this table and the table measures 22 inches long, then next time, if I decide to measure it next week, if there were no changes in those constants, notice that when I lay that ruler on the table, it's still going to be 22 inches. And if another person were to grab the ruler and does the same measurement, notice that it will remain the same. It will still be 22 inches. Another aspect that we are interested in is aptitude test. Now, when we are referring to aptitude test, something that I need to remind you is that aptitude simply means capability. It means the capability to learn certain things. Basically, what I am referring to is that aptitude refers to the potential of learning. So for example, here in America, we have the SATs. And the UK has something really similar, which is basically a test that measures your capability, your ability to be able to understand college level material. Notice that as your slide presented, we also have the GRE, and GRE is basically the same thing as an SAT, but the difference is that an SAT is from high school to college, and the GRE is from college to graduate school. So the intent of the GRE is to measure your ability and capability. This person does understand college, but can they understand graduate level material? An aptitude test is simply measuring your ability to be able to conduct certain skills or certain tasks. IQ tests have an unfortunate history of bias. Remember that we have very different factors that could contribute to negative impacts of bias and IQ testing. And I particularly want to talk about the aspects of non-cognitive factors and their influence in performance. So think about potential aspects of motivation, trust, anxiety, aspects that could affect your performance when it comes to your participation and engagement in said assessments. Notice that some of the stereotypes that we may encounter, for instance, is perhaps that girls are poor in math. Remember that the differences, the sex differences between males and females when it comes to their understanding of math is actually very small. So we have very little evidence to support that these differences do account for a lot of variability when it comes to a person's knowledge of math. Because of that specific stereotypes, we could expect a marked difference between how a female performs in math and how a male performs in math, not because there is an inherent difference, but perhaps of a contribution of bias. Now, another limitation of IQ tests is that they heavily rely on the culture. They heavily rely on the culture. So for example, if I provide an intelligence assessment, and in the intelligence assessment, there is, say, for example, a street light, right? And the intelligence assessment is measuring your comprehension of an image that has a street light. Well, perhaps the person has never seen a street light before. Does this mean that the person has less of an IQ, or does it mean that the person simply has not had the cultural exposure to said element? Well, because of this potential for bias, we have developed and have attempted to develop assessments that are, quote, culture free. So generally, these assessments tend to be nonverbal because In language, of course, there's many nuances to languages, and therefore, am I measuring your capability for language or am I measuring your IQ? So we have made it a point to attempt to not conduct assessments in that fashion in order to avoid bias, particularly with underrepresented groups. Now, notice that in a global sense, an international sense, there is an aspect that we have noticed that IQ has increased overall when it comes to the knowledge of individuals, right? Their measurements in IQ. There are many reasons that we could consider as to why individuals are scoring better in regards of IQ. Notice that one of them is better access to food. We do understand that malnutrition can significantly impact matters of measurement of IQ. The reason why we have school lunch programs today is because we did find that relationship between the impacts of malnutrition and the IQ of students. Notice that one of the aspects that we will also consider is that of Dawson Law. Basically, what we're trying to look into is the inverted U-shape function. Notice that if we were to pair poor performance with low arousal, we could also pair poor performance with high arousal, or we can also pair the best optimal performance, right? So the best aspect would be under the optimal arousal. Notice that something that I like to tell some of the individuals that I work with is that we actually do need a form of stress, right? That's something that if we have stress, some stress can actually help you in terms of reaching a goal. So for example, say you have an exam in the next following days. Notice that you're going to feel a level of stress. You're going to feel a certain type of arousal. And what's going to happen is that arousal, that stress is going to lead you to engaging in certain behaviors. So for example, I'm stressed because I have a test. So let me start studying. Let me grab my notes. Maybe let me schedule an appointment with my professor, maybe schedule an appointment with my teaching assistant. So notice that some stress was actually beneficial because it allowed you to carry on with certain tasks in order to reduce that stress. The problem is when this stress becomes distress and it actually starts stopping you from reaching certain goals. So for instance, because of the amount of stress that you're experiencing, now you don't want to study. Now it becomes anxiety inducing to look at your notes. Perhaps sending an email to your professor or your instructor may be really difficult. So notice that there is an optimal level for stress. Now, in keeping with our example, notice that if we have too much arousal, notice that can impact your aspects of test anxiety. Notice that we haven't noticed a sex difference, a gender difference between boys or girls. It seems to be pretty constant and pretty much the same across the actual stress levels and what can cause test anxiety. Now, notice that there is something that we like to refer to as stereotype threat. Notice that for some individuals, when we are thinking about that stereotype threat, think about the opinions that we may have about a certain group of people. So for instance, think about stereotypes like the one that I mentioned, that girls cannot perform well in math-related tasks. Notice that if that's an idea that I am keeping, when it comes time to me to conduct my assessment, I'm going to use that stereotype in order to inform my performance. So because of that, my performance can actually decrease. Now, some of the ways that we can look into measurements, right? We can actually use other aspects. So notice that we can focus on Spearman. Spearman, we're classifying general intelligence with a G and special forms of intelligence with an S. Notice that in this specific case, what we are trying to refer to is perhaps the skill that that individual carries. Notice that in regards to factor analysis, notice that we can also utilize 7 primary abilities. Now, we can utilize certain forms of intelligence in order to describe different types of reasoning. So let's look at Cattell. Notice that he proposed 2 separate types of intelligence. One of them is fluid intelligence. Notice that within fluid intelligence, what I'm trying to look into is reasoning, problem solving. Notice that a second type of intelligence is that of crystallized intelligence. Notice that in this specific regard, we are referring to is knowledge, but knowledge that we typically refer to as wisdom. And why is that? Because crystallized intelligence tends to grow as we age, right? So fluid reasoning is generally that is present, and crystallized intelligence is that continues to grow as we get older. Now, remember that I did mention how we utilize different theories to explain intelligence. And in this specific regard, let's look at 3 aspects. Let's look at 3 aspects according to Stenberg. One of the ones that I like to mention is aspects of analytic, right? Analytics in regards to intelligence. Notice that here we are referring to reasoning. We are referring to reasoning. In here, in regards to analytic, notice that what I am looking for in regards to analytical intelligence, what I am referring to is basically academic problem solving. I am referring to computation. We also have the aspect of creative intelligence. Notice that when you hear creative, I want you to hear the term synthesis. Notice that in this specific regard, what we're trying to do is create, right? We're trying to create new ways in which we can integrate our knowledge. So basically, an innovative way in which we can engage in problem solving. And lastly, the last thing that I like to talk about is specifically with this theory is of that of practical intelligence. This is what we like to refer to as, in a more colloquial sense, as street smart. What is street smart? Basically being able to adapt to your behavior. Basically what we like to refer to as common sense. And lastly, one of the things that I like to talk about is Gardner's multiple forms of intelligence. Notice that in this specific regard, he proposed that we have, or this individual proposed that we have a wide variety. We have different aspects, a different number of potential forms for intelligence. Notice that in regards to our biology, we are able to engage in each. So for example, think about your aspects of linguistic and verbal intelligence. Notice that we can also consider naturalistic intelligence. Some individuals may be stronger in the aspects of spatial and visual intelligence, and also musical intelligence, the appreciation of music. Notice that some individuals perhaps are more geared towards aspects that involve the body or sports. And another aspect is that some individuals may have a strong leaning towards being logical and mathematical. And lastly, if you're in the field of psychology, perhaps this is because you have a strong sense of interpersonal and interpersonal intelligence with other individuals and your ability to empathize and understand emotions. So this is the end of your lecture. I hope that this was immensely informative for you when it comes to the field of educational psychology. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.